Hello and welcome everybody to this 5th workshop in our Copernicus Earth Observation Data Visualization series. Today we're going to talk about climate extremes, heat waves, changes in ice, droughts and floods. My name is Christine Traeger-Chatterjee. I'm a climate applications expert here at EUMETSAT. We'll give people a few more minutes to join, and during that time I will say a few words on the logistics for today. So first of all, I would like to remind everybody that this session is being recorded and the recording will be shared afterwards publicly, so be aware of this. If you have any questions during this webinar, we welcome questions anytime. Then please use Slido and type in your question, and we'll have Q&A sessions in this workshop where the questions will be brought up. It's possible in Slido to vote up questions. So if you see questions that you're also interested in, just click on the thumbs up and it will be voted upwards. The default setting for all participants is that camera and microphone are turned off. However, if you would like to speak to us, if you would like your question in a bit more detail, for example, then you can request that your microphone is open and we will then do that. Okay, so I'm now going to share my screen. I hope, oops, oh, that was the wrong button. Here. Can I just check whether my slides can be properly seen? Okay, thank you. So as said, today's topic is visualizing data about climate extremes, heat waves, changes in ice, drought, and floods. We organized this workshop in collaboration between EUMETSAT and Copernicus. Maybe you have heard already who EUMETSAT is. EUMETSAT is an intergovernmental organization that was founded in 1986. We currently have 30 member states, and on behalf of our member states, we are operating meteorological satellites, mainly with the aim of weather observations for the purpose of weather forecasting, all aspects of weather forecasting. But EUMETSAT also has the mandate to contribute to operational climate monitoring, and I will say a few more words on this in just a moment. And in addition to all that, EUMETSAT forms the Copernicus space segment together with ESA. But in Copernicus, EUMETSAT not only operates satellites, but we also provide data and support users in applying these data to create societal benefit. So here is a bit of an overview of satellites which have been operating by EUMETSAT. At the beginning here, unfortunately, this plot is not complete, but you can see we have quite a history. So the first METEOSAT satellite was in orbit in the late 1970s. And since then, the amount of satellites that EUMETSAT operates and the amount of data that we manage is growing and growing. And this long-time archive is a real treasure, especially for climate monitoring. But it is not as easy as just going back to the archive and plotting the time series and off we go. There's a lot more to do on the way to provide stable data that are suitable for climate monitoring. And let me tell you a few more words on this topic. So here you see a series of or a number of satellites that we'll deal with, and I apologize, it's a bit small, but it's more than just the EUMETSAT satellites and Copernicus satellites. We collaborate with other space agencies in the world. We reprocess records of satellite data to create long-term records. So reprocessing, what does this mean? This means we calibrate the satellite measurement again to make sure the changes that we see over time are really due to changes in nature and not due to changes in the measuring infrastructure. We fill gaps, like, you know, if you have a satellite scene or a picture, and it may be that here and there some pixels are missing and are filtered out because they didn't meet the quality requirements at the time. But for the purpose of weather forecasting, it's more important that the data are available in due time until a model runs, for example. For climate monitoring, we have more time, and so we use this time to improve the quality of the data. We also apply then the most recent algorithm and the most recent auxiliary data that are available to retrieve geophysical variables, or we can apply new algorithms that have not been available at the time of the measurement. So with reprocessing, we aim to provide the best possible record of climate applications. And this is our support also to the Copernicus Climate Change Service. These long time series of satellite data records are really important input into reanalysis. So without the satellite data, the reanalysis would be substantially less quality. But we also develop together with partners geophysical variables directly retrieved out of the satellite data, and this is also provided. Some of them are also provided via the Copernicus Climate Data Store. I think a link to the Copernicus Climate Data Store is provided to you now in the chat, so you can click on it and check it out if you're interested to do so. I'm sure it's an interesting source of information. Today's topic is about extremes, but what do we mean when we talk about an extreme? It's not just a subjective measure, but we can really objectively say how extreme an event is. And for this, we need proper reference basis. And this is what we create climate data records for. So as an example here, I choose the sunshine duration retrieved also from EUMETSAT satellites. And if you're more interested in solar radiation from satellites, I would like to invite you to join our short course tomorrow, where we will introduce exactly this data record. There's still time to register, and you should also be able to find a link in the chat. But anyways, what you see here is the time series for Darmstadt, where EUMETSAT is located, starting in 1983. Ending in starting in 1983, ending in December 2020. And this is the annual sum of sunshine hours. You see it's going up and down, and as with any measurement, the values are dancing around a mean value. And there is a normal variance of these values, and this can be expressed in terms of standard deviation. And if we have an extreme, we refer to that as exceeding this normal variance. This normal variances. And for this, you can apply the 1 or 2 sigma standard deviations here. So just to remind you, I don't want to give a statistics course here, but just to remind you what we mean when we talk about extremes. And I'm sure we'll see much more sophisticated visualizations of extremes in the next couple of hours. And these are the experts who will talk to you today. First speaker is Peter Salamon of the Joint Research Center. He will talk about historical floods in Pakistan. Then we have Ben Loveday. Unfortunately, Ben Loveday can't be here in person, but he prepared a recorded presentation for you about ocean heat waves and sea level rise. Ben is also happy to take questions, so everything I cannot answer on behalf of Ben will be forwarded to him, and he will answer in written, and this can be provided to you as well. After Ben, there is Valentin Rakovsky from AFP. He's a data journalist, and he will talk about drought monitoring with the Copernicus Emergency Service. After Valentin, we'll take a Q&A session, having a look into your questions and answering as much of them as we can. And then we go into looking at sea ice anomalies. These will be presented by Zach Labe. He's a climate scientist working at Princeton University and at NOAA. And then we go on with air temperature anomalies in Arctic regions. This will be presented by Antti Lipponen from the Finnish Meteorological Institute. And then we have another representative from media, Letizia Davoli from TV 2000. She's a journalist, and she will talk about climate extremes in media. And last but not least, we welcome Jason Box. He's a climatologist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, and will be talking about monitoring of the Greenland ice sheet. And with that, I hand over to you, Peter.
Yes, thanks, Christine. I'm really glad to be here, and really thanks for the invitation. Now let me start sharing the slides. So while I'm sharing here the slides, and while they're uploading, basically, what I'll show today is a little bit about not only about the flooding center, how to visualize data from the Copernicus Emergency Management Service for the Pakistan floods, which was quite a large scale and quite a tragic event. But I think it's important also for users that visualize data coming from the Copernicus Emergency Management Service to know at least the basics about what the service is and how it works and what's the main purpose. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on that, and then of course we'll move into the topic, which means visualizing the data that we have in the emergency management service, and most importantly pointing you to all the different data that we have. Now, I have to say, I'm not I'm a scientist. I'm not working I'm not a journalist or somebody specialized in graphics and design. So I have a very scientific approach to the presentation today. I apologize for that already, but nevertheless, I hope it will be interesting for everybody. So let's get started. Just one last comment as well. So obviously this work, in particular work on the Copernicus Emergency Management Service, is of course done with a lot of contributors, service providers, as well as colleagues in different institutions that contributed also to this presentation. But I particularly like to highlight here the colleague here from one of our service providers as well, on specifically working on communication aspects for the emergency management service, Gabriel, who helped me also in some images on the slides that you will see. So let's have a quick look, as I said, first on what is actually the Copernicus Emergency Management Service. So it's one of the 6 services that we have in the Copernicus program. I'm sure you've heard about all the other services already. Christina already mentioned the climate change service, for example. And what we do in the emergency management service is we try to support all the different actors in the management of natural and man-made disasters. So we don't only talk about floods or forest fires, but also we have also products available. For example, there was the famous explosion in Lebanon, in Beirut, or any other kind of man-made disasters where we also provide some products for it. Now, the Emergency Management Service is managed by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. We are the ones responsible not only for the management, but also for the service evolution. So really trying to bring new developments into and updating the products always as good as we can. But of course, the operational running is done with the help of service providers. Now, we do try and address with our products all phases of the disaster risk management cycle. So from prevention and preparedness, so for example, through risk or vulnerability assessments, through risk maps or other specific products aimed at prevention, to the preparedness phase, in particular through early warning and monitoring systems, Then, of course, in the immediate response, we look at event mapping and monitoring in a rapid mode. You'll see that in a bit, including first damage assessments. And then also the recovery phase, so the post-disaster phase, we look at trying to use satellite-based recovery assessments or monitoring of reconstruction. Now, how do we do this? We, in a nutshell, now, I mean, we use a lot of different data. We don't only use satellite data. We combine data, of course, from satellites, and here the Sentinels from the Copernicus program play obviously a key role. But we do combine them with in situ and or model data in order to provide the products that you will see afterwards. But of course, this has also a consequence in a sense that when you want to work with the data, there's quite a large variety of data sets and data types, and also access points to that data within the emergency management service, as you will also see in a bit. Now, what is the emergency management service? How is it structured? Basically, we have three main blocks. One is called the on-demand mapping. And this is basically, as the name already says, a user, an authorized user, needs to activate for a specific event, let's say a flood or a risk assessment for a specific area, needs to activate the service, and then we produce maps like shown here on the left-hand side for the different situations. The second block is focusing on early warning and monitoring, and this is we have subdivided that into early warning and monitoring systems of the three most prominent or most frequent hazards and disasters that we have in Europe, but also worldwide. You are all familiar that floods, forest fires, and droughts probably have the biggest impact on economy and society, not only in Europe, but globally as well. And hence, we have decided to, for those specific hazards, set up a continuously monitoring and warning systems. Those consist of the European and global flood awareness systems. So this is for floods. We have, for the forest fires, we have a European Forest Fire Information System. The global counterpart, the Global Wildfire Information System, is under development. And then for droughts, we have the European and the Global Drought Observatories. So these, in contrast to the on-demand mapping, they produce data and products every day. Okay. And then last but not least, we have that's a relatively new component, which we call the exposure mapping component. And this is a bit in contrast to the early warning and monitoring, which produce everyday data, or the on-demand mapping, where a user needs to, let's say, activate for a specific hazard in a specific region the generation of the product. Here, these are, I'd call it, well, let's call it static data set. They're not really static. In fact, we do update them also relatively within a certain time period. But typically what we are trying to do here is to provide globally homogeneous information about population and buildup, which is fundamental when it comes to the measuring the impacts of disasters. So the population and the built-up information that we have in the emergency management service, and that are coming from the global human settlement layer, that some of you might have heard already, are of course used by the early warning and monitoring system, as well as by the on-demand mapping component, to do a first estimate when it comes to a disaster, or when we predict a possible an upcoming event, to have a first estimate on the impacts. So that's a little bit, let's say, the overview of the emergency management service, and let's move now into the part of you know, how we visualize data. And here, this is an example of different visualizations of data coming from the emergency management service. On the left-hand side, you see images representing the lava flow of the volcanic eruption in La Palma in Spain. The Spanish authorities activated the rapid mapping component, so the on-demand mapping component for this event, and we provided on an almost daily basis updates on lava flows and also the impacts on infrastructure and buildings of the spreading lava on La Palma, the island in Spain. Or in the center, you see a very recent one, the damage assessment for a region in Turkey based on the recent earthquake. On the right-hand side, you see a drought risk map published, I think, somewhere on the CNN webpage, looking at the current situation of drought. Or on the top as well, you see the fire danger map being produced by the European Forest Fire Information System. So you see, we have quite a large range of different products within the emergency management service, and also quite, let's say, heterogeneous data formats and data sets. And this is also reflected in the fact because one of the key questions is, of course, where can I find all this data? Now, because we have this setup in the different components, and because the data is mostly composed out of different input sources, so sometimes more on satellite data, sometimes both on satellite and modeling. You can see here quite a variety of access points to our data. In principle, you can see for the on-demand mapping, there is an activation viewer where you can see the latest activations. You can download the data sets. They're either in ready-made PDF format, but also accessible as vector files. Then for the flood early warning and monitoring, we have a wide variety of different ways to access the data. We provide them through a web map service, so through just visualizing information. But if you want to work also with the data, then that data is typically as a net CDF format. The forecasts are typically similar, like weather forecasts. They come in net CDF format. But we have also the global flood monitoring, which is a satellite-based flood monitoring. So in contrast to the forecasting system, this is also a new, relatively new development where you can then get also the information in TIFF files, for example, so the flooded area. You can download that through directly and then work with it in TIFF format or in other, also in vector format, in fact. Similar situation for the drought early warning and monitoring systems, forest files as well, mostly gridded output as well as the exposure mapping. Maybe one caveat to some of our data is that, as I said, the on-demand mapping only produces data where users activate it. Now, the question is, who are those users? The users in the case of on-demand mapping are mostly the national civil protection authorities. So they have to activate the service in order for us to start preparing and producing data. The data is then freely available, but we need an activation from a civil protection authority in the relevant country. And another caveat is that for the flood forecast coming from the European Flood Awareness System, we have the real-time forecasts are based on requests from the national authorities because they want to safeguard the one voice principle, meaning we only want to ensure that there's one authoritative voice warning for floods. Hence, we have restricted the real-time access to flood forecasts from EFAS for the first for the first 30 days. But after that, everything is freely available, meaning you can do anomaly maps, or some of you might know the European State of the Climate, where we have the river section, for example, is based on these simulations that we use or produce it as part of EFAS. So just keep in mind as well, if you use the data, also, although we try to provide good and high qualitative data, some of the data, of course, may contain sometimes errors, in particular when we have to produce maps in rapid mode. Of course, you can imagine a first estimate product needs to be there quick in order to support rescue efforts. That means that sometimes we need to be careful, or we need to be aware about the fact that sometimes errors may be contained in the data. And of course, I mean, I mentioned already the variety of data formats that we have. So it requires a bit of different levels of processing. Now I'm already probably very late in time, so just a quick view, an example of the Pakistan floods. So these were really extensive floods hitting almost, I think, 1/3 of the entire surface of Pakistan. And what you see here is a combination of a visualization coming from the global flood monitoring product. So this large-scale automatic flood monitoring, and you see on the image the blue areas which are highlighted as flooded. And in fact, this is a combination of several Sentinel-1 images which have been used to derive the flood areas between 15th and 13th of August, sorry. And then we have a specific rapid mapping activation for very specific areas. In fact, those were the areas where help was provided. For example, the Danish government had drinking water installations sent to the region. So there we did a specific monitoring using the rapid mapping component of the emergency management service to ensure awareness and to know where the flooded areas are and if they're receding or not. And then, of course, as a second example, let's see, this is the same example. If I manage to get this running, you can then, of course, do also nice animations with this in 3D and visualize all the different information that you can that we have as part of the emergency management service. So I'll stop here. I stop here because I think I'm already out of more than over my time. So thanks for your attention. And I guess we'll have time for some questions and comments then after the first block. So Christina, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And yes, indeed, we'll take time for questions after the first block. So there are 2 more presentations to go. Please feel free to use the Slido and type in your questions. And we'll now continue with the recorded presentation from Ben Loveday on ocean heat waves, sea level and sea level rise. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next presentation in our Climate Extremes Week, this time on ocean heat waves and sea level rise. My name is Ben Loveday. I run EUMETSAT's Copernicus Marine Training Service, and I'm going to talk to you about a few variables or phenomena that are interesting to talk about in the context of climate. But those of you who are eagle-eyed will spot that I've highlighted the word climate in red on my presentation, and we'll get to why very shortly. This presentation will consist of a bit of a 5-minute overview of some ocean variables of interest for us, and then there'll be a 10-minute demonstration of a Jupyter notebook on how we can practically look at marine heat waves. So to move on, some interesting things to consider in the context of climate when we're talking about the ocean. The prevalence of waves are a prime example. Changing wind fields associated with climate change can have an effect on the waves, how they're generated, their size, where they impact. This can become a major danger for shipping and for coastal environments. The change of heat can have major impacts on the upper ocean and in the mid-ocean as well. It can affect coral reefs, the biota, can also have implications for ocean atmosphere heat flux and kind of the interfaces between the atmosphere and the ocean. Sea level obviously is continuing to rise. Sea level is going to affect most of our coastal communities, so it's a fairly ubiquitous example of where we want to talk about ocean in a climate extreme context. And there are some other biological considerations we might want to consider around harmful algal blooms. But first of all, we need to consider what do we actually need to know to appropriately visualize climate extremes in the ocean. And the first point I want to make is the oceans are an extreme place anyway. Single events that happen in the ocean are very hard to link to climate. And whilst climate shifts the baseline, we need to decide what falls outside the context of that baseline that qualifies as an extreme. If you look at the graph on the right, which is from Shelton, from a paper from 2001, you can see this big overlapping series of Venn diagrams that describe ocean phenomena. And in climate change on the right-hand side, on the top right in the yellow, you can see this actually overlaps with basin scale variability with El Nino and with basin scale phenomena such as Rossby waves, which means, number one, it's relatively difficult for us to disentangle multi-decadal or even decadal components of natural climate variability with a climate change signal, especially in the ocean where we have some slow scales of variability and our records are not always maybe quite long enough for us to say something is definitively climate change related. So we need to understand the phenomena of what we're actually looking at before we decide to start to kind of attribute. We need to separate between what is real-time events, i.e. something that's happening now, and something that is kind of climate context. How extreme is this compared to normal? And when we visualize these, we need to visualize with this context in mind. What is the baseline behind an event? What is the likelihood or attribution to climate change as opposed to natural phenomena? And above all, we need to be really prepared for questions that will associate anything we put on Twitter or in social media linking a phenomena to climate. Here is a good example, harmful algal blooms. In some places, these are normal phenomena. They occur entirely naturally, entirely regularly. However, in other contexts, they are the result of anthropogenic effects, such as increases in pollution. The drivers and impacts for harmful algal blooms can be exacerbated by climate change scale interactions as well. Changing wind patterns, for example, can have effects on upwelling systems, and warming acidification can also be both drivers and impacts, and deoxygenation can be a strong impact from something like a bloom, causing these mass walkouts in the case of South Africa, where you can see all this marine life running away from the deoxygenated water on the beach, as shown in the bottom right. And the panels on the top right, the animation that's now stopped running now, we can actually see that there was an enormous chlorophyll bloom associated with all this marine life walking out of the sea in the hope of finding something to breathe. But this is an entirely natural event that occurs all the time in the coast of South Africa. So the example on the right is extreme, but we can't immediately link it to climate. And in the case of biology, individual events are still extremely heterogeneous, as in one bloom followed by the next bloom, followed by the next bloom can all be extremely different from each other. So establishing a pattern can be quite hard. So in the biological context, we may need 30 plus years of ocean color data from which we derive the chlorophyll to start to disentangle climate effects from decadal variability. This is a very good example of something that is extreme in the ocean. This is a very, very strong chlorophyll signal that we see in the Benguela upwelling system off the south coast of Africa. But this is not one that we can easily associate with climate change. So you have to take care when you're telling stories like this, because you will be asked questions about this. If you're interested, you can find these images and more information on our EUMETSAT case studies page. A more strongly example linked to climate change is that of sea level rise. On the top right panel, you can see the multi-mission altimetry product showing the average trend in sea level rise across the globe since 1992, the start of the altimetry record. And you can clearly see this upward trend of 3.35 millimeters per year, which is actually accelerating. And this is across the entire 40-year record. With 40 years of data, we are starting to be able to capture some of the multi-scale variability that we need to be able to account for to be able to pull a signal out of a long-term record to be able to say, okay, yes, this is climate change related. Multi-decadal ocean signals like ENSO tend to have some quite long period variability associated with them, and we have to be able to account for those in order to say definitively, okay, yeah, this upwelling trend is probably related, or almost certainly related in this case, to anthropogenically driven climate change. So mean sea level is an essential climate variable, but it's actually only one part of the story when it comes to looking at altimetry data for sea surface height. The other components we are interested in are sea surface height anomaly. So this is the part of the sea surface height above the mean sea level, and this is relative to the mean sea level at the time, so it gives kind of a dynamic change. So this is associated with short-term variability, e.g. around ocean currents, around eddies, but is also useful for us to gather information about what the ocean response is to things like storms and atmospheric loading. So this becomes extremely important for us when we're talking about coastal flooding. for example, or the impacts or exposure to coastal flooding, as the anomaly is added onto the top of the mean sea level, and it's the both parts together that kind of underpin the risk factor that coastal communities may face. From the altimeters, we can also derive information about waves. Significant wave height is a key variable for us to tell whether or not the marine environment is dangerous for shipping and or your own personal kind of recreational use of water, amongst other things. And the wave generation is in part linked to the wind field, so we can actually say, draw some conclusions about how climate change will change the wind field, which may have an effect on significant wave height as well. And in general, when we combine all these parts together, higher mean sea level driven by climate change, higher sea surface height anomalies potentially driven by storms, and higher waves, all of these three added together lead to greater coastal flood risk, something that's increasing for coastal communities around the world under the influence of climate change. If you want a nice way of visualizing some of this data, there's a link here to the CEMS ocean indicators, and the link will be provided in chat to you, so you can click on it. From here, you can look at maps of the regional mean sea level trends, such as the image shown on the bottom right-hand side of my picture, as well as seeing some breakdowns of the actual trends in certain areas around the European seas, as well as globally, to give you an image that's similar to the one shown on the top right, but not quite the same. Another example, marine heat waves. What are they? So marine heat waves are classified using thresholds versus a long-term average to tell us where sea surface temperature is above a given level than we would climatologically expect for a given amount of time. And the graph on the top right-hand side gives you an overview of what those tend to look like. So if you look at the dotted line, this is an example of a heat wave occurring above the climatological line. So the climatological line is the average, in this case, for sea surface temperature, usually approximating something like 40 years for this region. And we can actually categorize these in terms of their intensity from moderate to extreme. They can, again, be caused quite naturally. They can be caused by changes in ocean heat transport, movement of western boundary currents, or changes in thermocline variability. They can be caused by atmospheric systems, as well as ocean teleconnections, but they can also be driven by anthropogenic climate change as well. And there is a nice site where you can visualize some of these, and that's shown on the bottom right-hand panel. This is the one actually at the middle link, whalemap.ocean.dal.ca, which is an exact copy of the marineheatwaves.org one. But if you run on a Mac like me, you will find that the top one doesn't work because of a Java issue, so I recommend you go to the middle one. If you want one that's more specific to the Mediterranean, then I highly recommend the TMedNet one that's on the bottom. All of these allow you a degree of customization on the visualization if you want to look at marine heat waves for a given area over a given time. But I'm going to move on a little bit to look at marine heat waves in a bit more detail. Some of the impacts of marine heat waves that we may expect or may not expect. Marine heat waves have an effect on the impact, or have an impact on the air-sea flux of CO2. Warmer water is able to uptake less CO2, so we end up with more, with less CO2 being held by the ocean. More energy stored in the top of the ocean increases tropical cyclone heat potential, and we can expect tropical cyclone formation to occur more readily. There is fairly well documented effects on coral bleaching associated with marine heat waves. It's one of the major projects that's going on globally in terms of a concerted global effort to look at the effects of marine heat waves on bleaching. They have an effect on mammal and seabird mortality, and if you look at the graph in the bottom right, that actually shows you how marine heat waves affect species differently, with those on the very, very bottom right of the grey shaded area being the most exposed coral because they are unable to move and or adapt geographically, and those on the top left being less exposed, and that's from that Smith et al. Paper that I think in the text. They have a generally positive influence on the occurrence of harmful algal blooms, and they can implement spatio-temporal shifts in habitats that can affect fisheries. So marine heat waves have a kind of raft of effects. Recently in the media, this has been fairly well picked up, especially since a positive ENSO or El Nino phase was declared in the last few days. The sea surface temperature signal across the world ocean is fairly bleak. We have a plus, well, I think the global average now is around about +1 degree or so, with warmer extent shown across many of the regions shown in the graph on the left-hand side, taken from the BBC. And if you look at the time series as well associated with this, as taken from The Guardian, again, you can see that that the deviation for 2023 is far above the 1982 to 2011 mean that that kind of gives us our climatological baseline. So it's a series of stories associated with both marine heat waves, sea surface temperature, and ocean heat content that is currently very prevalent in social media and the media in general, and is going to get you probably some traction on social media if you work with this data, but you should be very clear about what data you're working with and why. And recently, EUMETSAT data has been used to look at marine heat waves in the Mediterranean. There's a top case study here linked to the picture on the right-hand side. And there's links to the article produced by the Copernicus Marine Environmental Monitoring Service, or CEMS, and to a recent paper by Thibaut Guinaldo looking at the marine heat waves off the coast of France in 2022, as well as marine heat waves that have been occurring relatively regularly now over the Great Barrier Reef, with 91% of coral affected in 2021. And we are going to take a closer look at these bottom two panels in our short practical demonstration for the next few minutes. So bear those two pictures in mind, the climate stripes on the bottom left and marine heat waves on the bottom right. So for our practical examples, we are going to spin up a Jupyter notebook on the Copernicus Wekio DIAS, the data information and access system that also supports EUMETSAT marine data and the Copernicus Marine Service marine data, brings them all together in a cloud environment that has a Jupyter hub associated with it where we're going to work. This is also linked to a case study that EUMETSAT published, which you can find on the top link. And that will actually link you to the code, so you don't need to remember the extremely complicated link. That is the second one on the list, which will take you to the notebook that we're going to work with. So this link that I'm highlighting here will actually give you full instructions for how you can spin this up on the Wekio system. I'm going to move straight to that system in the interest of time. So here is how this notebook looks for us. And we're going to take a very quick run through how this notebook drives. This is should be completely self-supporting and open for anybody to use once you have a Wekio account, or you can clone it to your local system. All I've done in preparation is I've downloaded all the data that I need to make sure that we have time to run this short demonstration in its entirety. So if you've not used notebooks before, anything that is in white or color, this is just decoration to describe how to use the notebook. And anything, as I scan further down, that is in gray is code for us to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go click kernel at the top here, restart, and I'm going to run all the cells. And this is going to run all of the notebook from start to finish. And we'll have a little talk over some of the key parts as we run through. So this is associated with our case study that we published on the EUMETSAT website, which is linked to at the top here if you want some more information. It gives clear information about the data set that we are using and tells you exactly what the notebook itself will teach you. Provides an outline about marine heat waves. What are they? How do we classify them? Why are they important? And how you can actually work with data to visualize them. Provided by a short overview of the contents of this code itself, and then the code as it actually works. So we use a relatively large batch of dependencies here. Here is a link of all the packages that we import, and we're going to work through 6 in this section parts of how this code actually brings everything together. I apologize if this is relatively quick, but we have quite a lot to cover in a short amount of time. The key part we import is this XMHW toolkit, which is an X-array implementation of the original Python toolkit for marine heat wave detection developed by Eric Oliver, all based on the original work by Loveday et al. And I highly recommend you read this paper. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just make a download directory, and we're going to define a pre-computed directory. So we're going to kind of work with some data on the fly, pre-compute some stuff, and then get rid of the data, because if you're running this on a remote system, then you don't really want to save all of that large data taking up space for you. I've chosen download data as false. If you click this to true, then this will download later data in the first instance. So if you're running this for the first time, you probably want true. The plot region, you don't really need to change. This just describes the level 2 SLSTR granules. We'll use it in the first plot. And then here, this part is where you download your data from the Ostia reprocessed SST record available from the Copernicus Marine Service over this 1 degree by 1 degree box in my case. So I've just defined a couple of functions that help us pre-process the satellite data for level 2. Just saves us a bit of time and a bit of storage space. If you want to work with this, you need to set up an account or set up the Wekio HTA adapter, Harmonized Data Access Adapter. If you're working on Wekio, you already have a Wekio account. And so all you'll need to do is make a short configuration file to authorize you to access it. This part of the code tells you exactly what you need to know to do all the authentication you need to make sure you can access the data through the HTA client. And this describes a little bit about how you actually use the client itself. But for now, I'm going to move on to how we actually how we get and plot the data, which is managed by this part here. This small query just tells us to get the level 2 data we'll use in our plot. This query can be taken directly from this show API request button on here. And then we're going to download the data and process it slightly, and then we'll get to how we get to plotting the data now. So in this part, plotting the SLSTR data, we're just going to take one or two examples, or two in this case, two examples of sea surface temperature data, instantaneous, taken from the SLSTR instrument that shows the sea surface temperature, not an anomaly, over the Great Barrier Reef area where we're looking, just to kind of situate us, to look at some of the variability we can see, quite strong thermal gradients between the south here and the north, though we're only covering a 3-degree variability here, so it's not that bit wide of a range we see, though sometimes this can actually get quite significantly more than this. But what we want to do actually then is look at this this longer time period of data, so from this Ostia SST data set, as described in this section of the code here, and all of this query here, exactly the same format as before, but with slightly different content, goes together to put together an output file called Ostia SST-NC. This is just what I've decided to call it. So when you download this file, it will be called something kind of strange with a long bit of numerics at the bottom. You should rename it to, or it'll be renamed to this file when we do this, this data gathering. We're going to do some short prep of this data. So we're going to take a time space average, and then we're going to bin that by year using the Xarray package. And then with a bit of processing, we can start to make things that maybe look a bit more familiar from a data visualization perspective. The first thing we can do is we can start to make some climate stripes for our 1 degree by 1 degree region. And if I just scan up again very quickly, we're looking at this area here, I believe, a little section in here, which is cloudy in the level 2 image, but is not cloudy when we look at the Ostia SST product. So we can start to see from 1982 versus the average, we really start to show quite strong warming signals in this area. 2016, less so in 17, then from 2022 onwards, we show very, very strong warming signals over this little box of ours. So we can take this data and we can feed it into our marine heatwave package as we do in part 6. We can make a climatology and we can look to see where our current sea surface temperature signal or how our current sea surface temperature signal compares to that climatology. And we can look at whether or not any of those comparisons show marine heat waves in the area. And all I've done here in this plot, and you can adapt the code above to kind of vary this as you want, is show the last 3 years of sea surface temperature data in our 1 degree by 1 degree box. And I've actually highlighted the second last marine heat wave. We can see all of these parts that are shown in this shaded area are all marine heat waves, with the red one being the latest one apart from this little blip here. And this shows us that since 2022, really, at the middle of 2022, much of the area has been subject to a marine heat wave. And so the Great Barrier Reef, like most coral reef systems, is currently being subjected to quite severe environmental changes, if you like, that are somewhat outside the expected norm and quite damaging to the coral reef ecosystem. That completes my whistle-stop tour. Please ask me any questions on Slido. I apologize for recording this in advance. I'm unable to make the meeting in person tomorrow. And if you want to know more, please use all the links that are provided on the on this slide to contact me at ops@eumetsat.int via our help desk, or find out more about our training courses, some of which coming up will be on ocean extremes and marine heat waves. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, I say thank you very much, Ben, although he's not here himself. Just a couple of reminders to use the Slido for questions. We already have seen some, which is great. I forgot to mention that it would be really helpful if you would mention the name of the presenter to whom you're addressing your question to. So if you could please do that, that would help us organizing the Q&A session afterwards. And to all presenters, you can already go to Slido and start answering the questions that are dedicated to you or where you feel you can answer, to start answer them in written. There has been a question on Slido on when the presentation and slides will be available. Gabriel, can you say something on that?
Yes, of course. So the slides for the workshop 2 will be on GitHub by the next week, and also actually the slides for the workshop 4.
Okay, and the one from this workshop, I assume, would need to wait another couple of weeks?
Yeah, just the time to coordinate with all the speakers. So probably if we're lucky next week, otherwise, I mean, every once all the slides are on GitHub, all the participants to this workshop will receive an email anyway with the direct link to GitHub. So just check your email and you will see when everything is uploaded.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And now we continue with Valentin Rakovsky, data journalist from AFP, and his topic is drought monitoring with Copernicus Emergency Service. Please go ahead, Valentin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this workshop. So my name is Valentin Rakovsky, and I work for the infographics and innovation service of the AFP. So we focus on data analysis and data visualizations and how we can use figures or geospatial data to enrich other news products like texts or videos of AFP. And I'm going here to explain how do we work and how do we manage to find data about climate extremes, and more especially towards the example of our coverage of heat waves and droughts. So when we talk about a trend or an evolution in media, it is usually clearer and more comprehensive to use graphics, data visualization, or maps instead of describing it with words. So here is a simple example of an AFP article about the last 8 years recorded as the hottest on Earth. So immediately we would like to know how high the temperature were, the temperature gap, the historical data, etc. And these questions are always better answered by drawing the curves instead than describing it. So this is basically how we the goal of our work. So this visual-driven storytelling is at the heart of our production. We add a supplementary level of understanding through these kind of visualizations. And it can work as a standalone graph that tells a story, or it can complement an article, a picture, or a video. So climate is, of course, one of the topics that we cover the most frequently. We use a lot of data from Copernicus, and here are some data visualization on topics that you may hear also from other speakers this afternoon, so temperature anomalies and ice sheet cover as well. We also use Copernicus data for natural disaster like earthquakes or floodings, thanks to the Copernicus Emergency Management Service. And as you can see, we produce a lot of maps. It's a very useful format, of course, but we don't do only this. We also like comprehensive raw data so that we can create bigger added values and more angled data visualization. If we have this kind of data like tables, we can visualize it in different ways depending on the news, the trend, and the context. So here is a simple example on the ice sheets. We have data provided by the Satellite Application Facility on ocean and sea ice from EUMETSAT. So the story about this graphic was the very bad beginning of the year 2023 for the ice sheet cover in the north, but especially in the South Pole. So with the raw data that we found, we could create a visualization showing exactly this point. So next time, if we have to draw another graphic on the same topic, but with another angle, because for another kind of news, but with the same data, we will be able to choose another visualization that is more appropriate and showing the best way, or message the best way. So a problem that we often face for climate coverage is sourcing issues. For droughts and heat wave, it's especially the case. So as we are an international news agency, ideally we should cover climate phenomena wherever they occur, but it doesn't happen all the time as we don't have immediate access to relevant data or the data is not available. So we find it, usually we rely on national weather agencies and we ask them for detailed data, but there are times when we don't get a reply or they cannot share their raw data with us or they cannot do it quickly enough. So here are good examples for the UK, France, and Spain, as they allow us to use their raw data on demand, but it's not always as simple. So we face bigger sourcing issues when we have to cover a larger region. So if we want to compare many countries together, we have to collect data from different national agencies that use different methodologies, different timescales, different indicators, and this is problematic because some data also are accessible and some are not. So here is an example. We wanted in January, to show all the countries that beat their temperature record in 2022. So I could show them on a map and just point them, but there's not much added value there compared to just mentioning them in an article. So it would be better if I could find a table with the maximum top temperature for each country annually. But this kind of resource doesn't exist, so I had to get the 2022 temperature and the historical record country by country from different sources. And this can quickly be a nightmare because some of these data are on Twitter, some on public reports, but only in an image like you have here on the right, which is not precise, and there was no data sheets attached. So I had to give up this project because it was too difficult to collect all the data. So for droughts, as for other variables, we needed a unique indicator produced by a unique source with a unique methodology and a unique scale. So we could compare the country with each other and cover a large geographic scale. So this is why we used for the droughts the combined drought index by the European Drought Observatory. This indicator takes into account 3 different variables from satellite observation: rainfall anomalies, soil moisture anomalies, and vegetation stress. And it gives a 4 steps scale. The first step is no drought. The second is watch if there is rainfall deficits. Then warning for soil moisture deficits due to rainfall deficits. And finally, alert for vegetation stress after soil moisture and rainfall deficits. So the European Drought Observatory releases this indicator every 10 days with a 10 days or 2 weeks delay. And they release it as geospatial data on this map. So we release the map on our side as it gives a good general insight of the situation at the scale of the continents. So here is one for the 10 first days of May. But now if we want to get rid of maps and to make our visualization more diverse and to look for other angles, if we want to focus on a precise time period or a precise area. So we had to move from this map to figures and to graphics. So the products available for download on the EDO, the European Drought Observatory platform, is this map, which is geocoded. So for those who are not familiar with the term, a geocoded picture means that each pixel of the picture has not only a color, but also GPS coordinates. So the picture can be interpreted by mapping applications like QGIS or by coding programs. So from these maps, we can generate many other data, including tables and texts. So to convert the maps into figures, we have a few Python scripts. So I will spare you the technical details, as running this code takes very much time. And as the principle of the script is quite easy to understand. So we first take the map that is available for download. We take a shapefile, which is a geometric form, geocoded as well, and representing the boundaries of a country or a group of countries. And we overlay these two shapes. So we keep only the part of the map located inside the borders of the country. And then we count the amount of pixel of each color inside of the polygon. So the resolution of the image is 5 kilometers. One pixel covers 25 square kilometers. And we apply this for each country and each date. And we get this database. So for each country or region, for each date, we know which part of the territory was ranked as drought risk in square kilometers and in percentage of the territory. So the very first use of this database is to generate texts and not directly visualization. So we need to find out relevant figures, like the one that the European Drought Observatory releases itself on their Twitter account at each update. So our environment department uses these figures to write articles. Like here is an example. For Spain and Portugal, which experienced a very tough drought episode in this April, and it's still ongoing, with more than 80% of their territory hit by droughts. So from the European Drought Observatory data that we received and analyzed, we had an article mentioning that like the percentage of the territory that is hit by droughts, and also mentioning that this drought episode ranks among the 5 worst ever recorded since the beginning of the records in 2012. But when saying this, the first question that you may have is, if this drought episode ranks among the 5 worst ever recorded, when were the other droughts episodes, and were they as severe as the current one? And thanks to our database, we can answer these questions in a clearer way than we could do with words. So as we have the time series, we can easily see how severe the current droughts is compared to the past ones, and see that those episodes are getting more frequent. So as among the 5 worst ever recorded, 3 of them occurred in only 1.5 years. So this was the visualization we chose for Spain and Portugal this time. But now that we have raw data, there are a few other angles and drafts that we can test because we have raw data. So here we can compare drought episodes in Europe during a specific time of the year. So you can see, you can compare like during the former years at the same season, the same month, was the situation better or worse than it is now? And you can see the global trend that the situation is roughly worsening across the years. Or another choice could be to filter only the episodes during which more than 30% of the territory was hit by droughts. So here for Europe, we can see that there are more and more droughts in the last 10 years. And so with the bubbles on the left, so the color and the size are proportions according to the length of the episodes. And so we can see that these drought episodes occur more frequently, and when they occur, they hit larger regions. And on the right is the number of days during the year where more than 30% of the European territories are hit by droughts. So all these visualizations are not relevant enough to be released, all of them. But we have the data to do the trials and to see if the graphic works or not. And if one day we have news that is especially related to this point, we can release them very easily. So as you saw, we can do many interesting works with geospatial data, but for visualization, the best input for us is also databases and raw tables with solid figures, and as much as possible, historical data to analyze the figures across time. So another example that we use is EFIS, so the service of Copernicus dedicated to wildfires. Here we have both mapping data, so we can draw maps of the fires, and CSV files, so we can draw our own graphics and vary the visualizations. So to sum up, I would say that we try to use as much data as possible among those provided by Copernicus. We are still looking for new ones, and we are glad to find such a large range of geospatial data on this hub, even if sometimes we need to know very precisely where to look at among all the different data hubs. Like the Climate Data Store, the Emergency Management Service, the European Drought Observatory, the Joint Research Center, EFIS, etc. So the strongest points of this is the very large range of indicators that are available, the frequency of the releases, and the fact that we can study very large geographic ranges with a single source and methodology, and this is a really strong point. But above all, what we look for is also data that are not especially geospatial ones. We also look for tables, as all the visualizations that are not maps start from there. And it can be really anomalies of for temperatures, rainfall, droughts in Europe or by country or globally. And this is also what we did with sea ice extent last winter. And this makes a transition with who comes next. So here is a mix between use of data from Copernicus, EUMETSAT, and NOAA. Some provided tables and provided maps, and we had many possible ways to show the trends, the records, to compare the years. So this was also quite a comprehensive work. And finally, I hope I managed to show you an overview of our production and our use of climate data maps, but not only. So as you can imagine, the more data we find in free access and the happier we are, whether it is geospatial data or tables. And about this, we are very grateful to Copernicus for all the data they provide to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentin. I see we are quite advanced in time already. Nevertheless, we should at least have a quick look at the questions that have arrived in Slido so far. Just waiting until they appear here. Yes, so again, to all presenters, you can already go to Slido and answer the questions in written. I tried to summarize a little bit the questions. I think most of them are more general questions as far as I've seen. First question is, and that was also voted pretty high, which is the best practice in combining climate models, for example, CMIP, and satellite data in a comprehensive climate risk and vulnerability assessment. This is, I tried to go first with this one, but if any of the presenters would like to jump in, then please take the floor and do so. This is not a trivial question. So first of all, satellites, of course, cannot provide you with an outlook or a forecast. Satellite data are used as an input for climate models or forecast models, though you may be able to use satellite data to compare model outputs with reality. But as far as I know, at least here at EUMETSAT, we don't have, at least not yet, I noted it down to discuss with colleagues, a best practice guide on how to do this, because there is a lot of special knowledge required also from the modeling side. But and this is also an interesting discussion, and we are collaborating a lot also with climate modelers, and we are in continuous discussion of how should I say, co-evolving satellite data and how they are provided and how they can best be used in the context of climate models. Any of the presenters have an opinion or a view on this question? I see, Peter, you're smiling.
Well, I mean, I cannot add a lot to this because this is indeed a very tricky question, and it goes well beyond just visualizing data. I mean, it is this is not it's definitely not straightforward, and as you said as well, I mean, satellite data provide you the basis basically for let's say the current situation, and should be used to kind of support or underpin that baseline, and then you use typically the climate model projections in order to look at the future risk or the predicted risk for a specific hazard. Now there's not one single best way to do it. It depends on the hazard that you look at. It depends on also on what the length of the time series you have available on the satellite data. I mean, there is a million of factors to be looked at, and I think that to do that, you actually need to have a proper scientific and a deep analysis in order to come up with a comprehensive climate risk and vulnerability assessment, at least according to my opinion.
Yes. Right. So as said, I took note about this. Maybe it's an interesting one to at least come up with some bullets on best practices for this. I'm sure there will not, at least not in the near future, a step-by-step guide that you can apply generically to questions related to that. I don't see that at the moment. Okay, next question is if a 60 years long record is enough to see signals in most climate scale effects. Well, this is also not a question that it can simply be answered with a yes or no. Generally, what is usually used to calculate climate normals, and where you can already see a lot, is the 30-year climate normal. This is the standard WMO reference period that is usually applied. We are now entering a period where we have at least some satellite records that cover these period. However, there are climate phenomena if they only happen only on a, I don't know, 7 to 10 year basis, mentioning an ENSO cycle, for example. For this, 30 years are probably not enough. 60 years, one needs to see that also really depends on the characteristics of the climate phenomena you're looking at. The other questions are around how people can extract images from the satellite data, and some have expressed a bit of a disappointment that we cannot take more time here to look into the data processing and into how really produce visualizations in practice with a bit more hands-on. We've also taken note about this because we run topical workshops. For example, Ben is running workshops on marine applications. I, from time to time, run workshops on climate applications where we really dive into this topic, but these are usually a week long, or at least several days long workshops where we work really with hands-on data and Jupyter notebooks and other tools to visualize this. So for something really, a 2-hour session is way too short to do this. Usually the workshops that I was mentioning are more really down to applications. So visualization is really only just one aspect of those. But I was just talking to my colleagues here in the room who have also organized this webinar, and we took note to consider this and to come up maybe with a workshop in the future to really do some more hands-on. So we look into this and see what is possible. Okay, then there is another question why we don't consider cyclones as extremes. Well, yes, a cyclone is an extreme weather event. It's not necessarily an extreme climate event because cyclones simply happen naturally. That's part of the natural variations in the weather system. However, there's no doubt there are extremely strong cyclones that we have never seen before. And this is then, of course, an extreme event. Data for Africa, yes. I see that also that this is challenging. However, with the satellite data that are also provided in the context of Copernicus, they also cover Africa, and there are collaborations with African services and the African Union Commission already existing. So I would, if you're interested in these, I encourage you to reach out to these organizations or also to the Copernicus services directly or to us at EUMETSAT. We have collaborations ongoing. I'm not saying that we can help you immediately and point you to some data records. Sometimes we can, not always, but we can help you finding the right connections and see how you can access data from there. Okay, I'm really sorry. I know there are further questions here. We will answer them in written, but now we need to proceed in the interest of time. Otherwise, we won't manage to get everybody through. Apologies on that one. So our next presenter is Zach Labe from Princeton University and NOAA on sea ice anomalies. Zach, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. So as was said, my name is Zach Labe. I'm a climate scientist. And so I admit I'm not an expert on data visualization, but hopefully in this short 15 minutes, I'll be able to sort of share my story. My research really is on thinking about how do we disentangle climate change versus natural variability using things like climate model large ensembles and machine learning. But again, today I want to focus really on data visualization and sort of start off with my really overarching and almost obvious message is that the climate is changing in real time. And I didn't anticipate, if you asked me a few years ago, that I would be really, science communication would be a really big part of my life. But my background really initially was in sort of meteorology, and I was interested in going into weather forecasting. And we know that weather is something we talk about day to day. We also, experience weather forecasts like on television every single day. Even though climate is operating on sort of different time scales, I was wondering, how can we think about sort of sharing climate data, especially as extreme events begin to increase? How can we share more of this data to a broader audience in real time? And one area where, climate change is really happening quickly is in the Arctic. And so today I'm going to be sort of talking about how I got started with thinking about how do we visualize things like sea ice anomalies to sort of share the data with a broader audience. And not only do I think that sharing this data makes sort of science more accessible, but it also sort of offers the opportunity to sort of rethink about research problems for my own scientific research. And so things I got interested in is, how can we visualize sea ice data, day to day? So this is just one example of sort of a satellite project. Here we're looking at sea ice thickness on the left-hand side panel. And then on the right-hand side panel, you're taking a look at sort of the 1-year difference between 2022 and 2023 sea ice thickness, just as a way of, monitoring where are areas of thicker ice versus thinner ice. And I've really got interested in, how do we not only visualize data, not just sort of the average across the whole Arctic or the whole Antarctic, but how do we think about regional patterns of change, regional anomalies? Because what we've learned, in the last decade or so of understanding climate science is that it's really regional patterns of change and trends and extreme events that are really what are impacting people, they're impacting ecosystems and sort of the whole Earth system. So this is a graphic showing sort of an example of, instead of taking an average over the whole Antarctic, how do we look at changes in sea ice for individual regions to really understand where are the anomalies in real time? And then this is using, again, satellite observations over the last 40 some years. And I think, again, this is really an opportunity to communicate, not only to communicate climate change, but really communicate climate science as a whole. And I think not only does it share what's going on, but it also helps to sort of improve trust in the data and trust in the scientific community. So I want to start off with sort of a schematic of, again, why I think this is really important. So what you're looking at here is just a graphic of the seasonal cycle of sea ice. So there's no axes here, again, just a schematic. But on the left-hand side, the upper peak, that's sort of at the end of the northern hemisphere winter when sea ice extent reaches its maximum. And the bottom there is sort of the minimum period. That's at the end of summer in September when sea ice reaches its minimum. So for many years, when we talked about Arctic sea ice, even though we know there's a huge trend in the loss of Arctic sea ice associated with climate change, many, articles in the popular media would sort of focus on two main stories during the year. How big does sea ice get at its maximum and how big does it get at its minimum? And that was it. But we know that sort of looking at sea ice day to day, there is lots of variability. There's the typical variability associated with weather, but increasingly we're seeing sort of variability due to extreme events. So what you're seeing here now by the red line added on is one particular year. This is in 2016, where there were a number of extreme events within the Arctic, particularly sort of on the right-hand side, where we saw actually dips in the amount of sea ice due to sort of unusually warm events like a Arctic heat wave. And so by communicating this data in real time from day to day, we can tell these stories of regional extreme events, and these regional extreme events affect people that live within the Arctic. And again, this is all about telling stories and all about starting conversations. So one example of an extreme event that received a lot of attention was a few years ago in 2020, where there was a record early decline in the amount of sea ice along the Siberian coast. So you can see by the red line, that's sort of the 2020 outlier year. And then the thin lines are all the other satellite observations. In visualizing the data in this way, I can tell a few things. So I use color to show the trend. So older year lines are in purple and the more recent years are sort of whiter. So you can see there's been a sort of long-term decline by this sort of purple going to white as it decreases year to year. But then you see there's lots of squiggles, and that's sort of your year-to-year variability. So I like using, sharing lots of data, but thinking about it and how can we represent dimensions in different ways to communicate different stories. And here's a sort of visualization that's a bit different, but sort of is showing the same extreme event. This is actually next summer. There was another extreme event along the Siberian coast. So a lot of sea is right along Siberia. And instead of showing all those lines, all those days and years, here I'm sort of just showing the average for June, July months from over the satellite record. Again, showing that, there's lots of variability from year to year. This is due to natural climate variability or things like changes in weather. But you can see in recent years, there's sort of a decreasing trend that's becoming more and more emergent in this time series. And then you can see by the scatter points, like in 2021, this huge outlier again. And then this extreme event would not have been necessarily captured by only focusing on sort of the maximum and minimum sea ice, but instead by sharing this data, we can sort of tell these stories all throughout the year. And here's an example of a more current event that's ongoing now in the southern hemisphere and in the Antarctic. So right now we're seeing record low of our Antarctic sea ice extent. And this graph is actually from a few weeks ago. So if you actually plotted the red line showing the anomaly of Antarctic sea ice, you would actually see that line decrease even more. And this has gained a lot of attention, both in the popular media, but also in the scientific community to better understand what's going on. So here's an example, really bringing it back to not just talking about the extremes, but what are the impacts of these extremes going on in real time? So here was a really big anomaly during the winter of 2020 or 2018. And what you're looking at on the right-hand side is a map of the sea ice concentration. On the right-hand side is Alaska. On the left-hand side is Russia. So you're looking at sort of the North Pacific and the Bering Sea. And essentially during this period in the February of 2018, there was a remarkable retreat of sea ice in the Bering Sea, which would normally have been sea ice covered over the last many, many decades. And then on the left-hand side, this extreme event just shows all of the communities that were impacted by this record anomaly of sea ice. And again, by, sharing this data in real time, we can share these stories of communities being affected within the Arctic due to these anomalies. And then in addition to, communicating the impacts, to communicating through science communication, it also helps, understand and craft research problems. So we were tracking, many of us were tracking this sea ice anomaly on things like Twitter and social media, which actually led to a group of us getting together to write a research paper and sort of trying to better understand the context of this extreme event in the Bering Sea, both through, again, natural climate variability, but also trying to understand what the role is of human-caused climate change. So again, I think by thinking about data visualization, it's not only a benefit for making it science more accessible, but it's also a benefit for crafting new research questions, especially in rapidly changing regions like the Arctic. And we can not only sort of present sea ice anomalies and data visualization of what's happening in real time, but we can also look at sort of long-term trends. So here you're seeing an animation of changes in sea ice thickness on the map, and then the bar graph is showing the change in volume to communicate, again, year-to-year variability as expected, but the long-term trend due to climate change is the rapidly declining amount of sea ice thickness and volume. We can also show sea ice anomalies for things like climate model projections, things about going forward into the future. So what you're seeing here is a climate model. If you're interested, this is from the CSM1 large ensemble. And you're looking at sort of an animation of that projection from that particular climate model going through 2100 during the month of September. So when sea ice reaches its minimum, and again, this is sharing the message of what types of data do we see in climate model projections and how can we visualize that to a more accessible audience. So how do you get started? And I wanted to share one of my favorite websites. This is from Copernicus Climate Change Service. And what you're looking at here is this page called Essential Climate Variables. And this is updated essentially at the first week of the month for the previous month. And what it really allows you to do is to look at these really important critical variables and sort of retrieve gridded data very easily. It does not require any coding. You can just sort of click on what you're looking for here. Like I can click on sea ice, and then I can pick on whether I want to look at the average sea ice or whether I want to look at the anomalies of sea ice, and I can pick what month and year, and you can just click these different points and output the data, which can be easily read in a coding language to present maps like some of the ones I've shown today. If you're interested in more sort of average metrics, another great website is from OCSAF, which is their Sea Ice Index. So they output, again, publicly available data in real time that takes a look at things like regional Arctic sea ice and Antarctic sea ice, and you can plot graphs of this like in time series. And again, this is all, very readily available data it doesn't require as much post-processing to sort of make some of these visualizations. But one thing to sort of show what some of this data looks like is this map here. I'm taking this from sort of the Copernicus Climate Change Bulletin that comes out monthly, which sort of summarizes climate conditions around the world. So what you can see here is sort of a representation of some of that data I was talking about on the Essential Climate Variable page, which is showing on the left-hand side a map of sea ice concentration, and then on the right-hand side what the anomalies were for last month. So again, you can really, if you're just starting working with some of this data, you can compare, how does your data look like when you visualized it versus how it's presented in something like the Climate Bulletin to sort of give different visualization comparisons. I want to point out some challenges. The word anomaly in itself is a challenge for science communication. When I share the word anomaly, often people think of the word anomaly being as something weird, but in climate science, we use it sort of to communicate a different message, where anomaly in climate science means it's sort of a deviation from an average. As was mentioned earlier, in climate science, we often use 30-year periods to sort of denote the average. So essentially, to compute an anomaly is you take like one specific month or year and then subtract out like a 30-year average, which gives us this deviation. So what I'm showing here is a comparison between using two different 30-year periods, because one of the most challenging parts of representing climate anomalies like sea ice anomalies is how do you pick your 30-year periods? Originally, there was a period that was used more recently from 1981 to 2010 was sort of represented across the climate science community as the 30-year period to use. And then more recently, there's been a push to sort of advance it to 1991 to 2020. But as you can see, just by picking which period you're doing can really change how you visualize the data. In particular, you can see on the right-hand side, there's sort of the less red color, and that's because you're using a more recent 30-year period where more climate change is, impacted. So when you're presenting this data, I think it's really important to think carefully about what is the story you're trying to tell. And from my own experience with science communication, I personally find consistency to be very important. So changing baselines, depending on which graph you show, can be very confusing for audiences. So I think it's best to be consistent and explicit for what baseline periods you're using. And admittedly, this question I get daily, many times per day, actually, about how to choose baseline and reference periods and why do they change. And sometimes you're limited about what baselines you can actually use depending on what data set and how far back the data set goes over. That I actually had to create a sort of a frequently asked questions page on my visualization website just to go over, this baseline period, in that, it is confusing and there can be misinterpretations. And especially if you're trying to tell a climate change story, I think it's more important to go with earlier baseline periods so you can really share how much of the anomaly is represented, particularly due to climate change when there's been such a long trend in sea ice. And so lastly, I just want to mention that, one important factor in thinking about data visualization, like for CS anomalies, is thinking about accessibility. So I've mentioned accessibility in terms of making the science more accessible, but there's also a whole science of making an accessible figure. So things like thinking about how do you think about color contrast, or how do you label your data, and how do you use titles to almost use it as a caption to really share what's going on in your figure. So there's a whole field, many of us think that accessibility and visualization is just related to color and making colors that are more colorblind friendly, but there's actually many different attributes of thinking about visualization accessibility that's really important to consider. And if you're going to share this type of data, I think it's important to consider some of these points. It's also important to consider, make sure you label where the data set is coming from. And of course, as I mentioned, the baseline period. And I think data visualization really brings us all together for something as big of a problem as climate change. We really need people thinking about it from all different angles. And although my primary focus is on scientific research of climate change and climate variability, I really think, data visualization that I do almost as a hobby or on the side really helps me to think about how do we think about climate change, working together across different communities. And again, I think that's just really important for a region such as the Arctic, where changes are happening so quickly. And I will end here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zach. We continue with Antti Lipponen from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, and he will talk about air temperature anomaly in Arctic regions. So we stay in the Arctic, where we go from ice to air.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk in this workshop. So today I'll be talking about air temperature anomalies in Arctic regions. Although maybe obvious, and Zach just gave a perfect explanation, I would like to begin with the definition of temperature anomaly. So temperature anomaly is the departure, positive or negative, of a temperature from some base temperature, and the base temperature is often selected as an average temperature of a base or a reference period. So as an example, in Paris Agreement, the aim is to limit the human-caused global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. So here, the global temperature anomaly would be +2 degrees, and the base period would be pre-industrial times before us started affecting the climate. So in a warming climate, the selection of the base period is, of course, this affects the numerical value of the temperature anomaly. And as the climate is warming, so basically the earlier in industrial times the base period is selected, the larger numerical values for the anomalies you get. So the temperature anomalies not only depend on the actual...
Can I just check? Have you changed your slide already? Because we still see
No, I haven't.
Okay, good. Okay, just making sure. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, so the temperature anomaly, it doesn't depend not only the actual temperatures, but only on the selection of the base period. So when presenting these temperature anomalies, you need to think about suitable base periods and depending on the main message you want to tell. So if you, for example, want to tell about the today's hot temperature in your hometown and how exceptional it is in current climate, you should select quite recent base period. But if you want to tell about long-term climate change, as Zach already mentioned in the earlier talk, you would select older base period. And just for the note, I haven't still changed my slides. In the temperature, base period should also be long enough. So I usually use at least 30-year base period. So, and what I often select as well is years 1951 to 1980 to be long enough in the past, but also be not too uncertain. As you go longer into the past, it will be more uncertain. So also in the term, I find the term temperature anomaly somehow confusing for the audience. So I sometimes use temperature change instead of temperature anomaly. So there are many ways you can visualize temperature anomalies. So this is one visualization I made to learn how different countries vary from each other. So this is showing all countries in the world, and these circles here in this visualization, they show the temperature change or temperature anomaly. So the larger and the more red the circle is, the warmer the year was, and the larger and blue the circle was, the colder the year was, with respect to the base period of 1951 to 1980. So let's play it. So here you can see as years go forward, you see more or less the natural variability, and then around the year 1950 or so, or from now, you can start seeing more and more orange as we go forward in time. And when we approach year 2000, you just see more and more red and orange. And then when we reach year 2022, it's quite a lot of red, not much blue seen anymore in this graph. So this is one example of visualizing temperature anomalies or temperature change I have done in the past. Then there are also these really nice monthly updates from Copernicus Climate Change Service, so showing the surface air temperature anomaly. And this example is for the April 2023. So here it is shown as a map. So here base period is now 1991 to 2020. So it's slightly different what I usually use. So these maps nicely show how the temperature anomaly was in that month and in global, and then there is a zoom in for Europe. So, but when seeing these and looking at, I'm from Finland, so for Finland, Arctic is very important region, and as we are located up here north, and it's a quite active topic of discussion here in Finland. So I wanted to make some kind of regular updates and more concentrating on the Arctic region. Also, if I to stress the importance of Arctic region, if I cite our president Sauli Niinistö, so he said that if we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. So it's highly fragile environment, and the temperatures are very rapidly rising in the Arctic region. Last year, we actually made a study and published it, and we found that the Arctic has warmed nearly 4 times faster than the globe since 1979. So it's warming up at the moment 4 times faster than the globe, so really, really rapidly. So in my opinion, it deserves some kind of constant attention. So then I started thinking that I would like to produce a monthly map of the Arctic temperature. So what would I need for that? A good data source was one first requirement, and preferably near real time and open access. So I don't want to communicate how the Arctic was months ago. I would like to do it as fast as it happens. So early in the month, I would like to already show how the last month ended. I would like to have easy, repeatable workflow for monthly updates. So every month I don't have a lot of time to do this, but I would like to still provide others monthly updates. So I decided to do a temperature map of the Arctic, and in addition to that, a time series graphic. So what I decided to use, I decided to use ERA 5 data because it's really nicely accessible from the Copernicus Climate Data Store, and I use this toolbox. Why I use this toolbox? You can download the data directly from the Climate Data Store, but in the toolbox, I can directly compute the anomalies as I want. So here on this slide, you can see the full code I have. So you can run on the Copernicus servers. They already compute the anomalies there, and then I just download the anomaly data. So this will make my life quite easy, as I can just directly download the data I really exactly want for my visualizations. And here I can, for example, define the interval, so the base period from 1951 to 1980. I find this highly useful and really nice tool. So this is now the format I ended up with. So my idea was first I wanted to experiment a bit. So I wanted to be some kind of maybe newspaper front page style of image, what I want to show. So on the left-hand side, you can see the main graphic I produce monthly for the April 23. This is a map of the Arctic region, and then there is this summary plus 2.1 degrees Celsius warmer than the baseline. What I've learned during the process is that I started with Celsius, and then there were many people from the US that contacted me that we would like to have this in Fahrenheit as well. So at some point I added that one as well. So if you want to do communications globally, even though there are not too many countries using Fahrenheit, I was asked for that, and I have given some feedback that they really like to see in a unit that is more familiar for the US audience as well. And then, of course, this plus 2.1 degrees Celsius does not say too much about the monthly. So I want to show always how it has been for the full time series. So on the right hand side, you can see this kind of quite normal map or the graph showing the time series for that specific month. So it will show as this kind of line plot, the temperature anomaly for the April Arctic. And it's what I wanted to show. I want always to highlight the ranking of the month. So I always point out which months or which years were warmer than the current year. So to get some kind of overall picture where we are going and where we are at the moment. So I have been posting these on my Twitter account. So every month I update, and here you can see some regular updates from when I started this more or less on December 21 or maybe November, October 21, but then I started and it got quite nice attention. So as you can see from the retweets and comments in the beginning. So even though it's not getting as much attention nowadays, but I still continue to do it, and I post it every month, this graphic to follow, to learn myself, and keep myself updated, but also give the information for others with this front page graphic I made. So what I like about this Copernicus data, as I mentioned already, this is really easy access, and this, especially this toolbox and these climate and atmosphere data stores have improved a lot over the last years, in my opinion, and I want to thank all the people who have been involved in improving. It's a really, really nice tool and easy access. Open data is always really good. I can just go and download and use it as I want. It needs to be trustworthy if I want to use it and widely used. So ERA 5 Copernicus data for sure fulfills that requirement, and it's really nice about it. There's validation reports available, and it's really found to be trusted source. Wide variety of variables are available, so not only temperature, but a lot else as well. And what I need, as I mentioned earlier, it's available when needed. So only roughly 5 days on the 5th day of the month, I can already get the data. So it's timely communications then when I do it. So it's really nice. So with this, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antti. And we immediately continue with Letizia Davoli. She's a journalist at TV 2000 and will talk about climate extremes in media. Letizia, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you for your invitation. I'll try to share my screen. And I'm sorry for my terrible English, so I'll try to do my best to make you understand. Just a few minutes about my work. Working on television is very difficult to be a science communicator on television because tell me if you see the PowerPoint.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so I begin. Okay. It's very difficult because as you see, you had just 10 minutes to talk about your research, and on television we have only 1 minute and a half to talk about something about space or science or satellite. So I always say that a science communicator on television is a missing link between research and people, and we have to translate the difficult language of research in something that people can understand very well and can see. Working on television is very different from working for the newspaper, because a newspaper you have the paper to print images on, and you have a lot more space to talk about, to write about something. On television you have to work with the video, so with images, and less time. And so you have to manage between what your editor-in-chief asks you to talk about something that is happening in some part of the world, and the necessity to explain it in some simple word to people. So using satellite is always a big help to make people understand, but at the same time it's not easy because a lot of people in my experience doesn't know what satellites do, doesn't know that Europe is a constellation just like Copernicus, and so you have every time to explain again that we have this so important instrument to study our country, to save people, to save our environment. And so in recent time, I work about, as you see, the floods in Romagna, floods in Marche in 2022, and the drought in northern Italy in 2022. You remember the Po River, you see in the image, and but the most important is the floods areas in Romagna just a few weeks ago. This has been a terrible tragedy for Italy, and satellite images, Copernicus, Sentinel, was very important to show people what was happening in that part of Italy, and to show how great was this area damaged, destroyed by floods. But the instrument that I usually use, as you see, are the Twitter account of Copernicus EMS or EUMETSAT, because they are so easy to use. They are very fast instrument, because I can find the tweet, and then I can immediately go with the link to the page on internet that can help me to understand and to read about what is happening and what is this map about. One problem of people, journalists who work on television, is that we have only a few seconds to explain something in the news, but we have even very few time to study and to look for information. And so having this instrument, just like Twitter, that can send you immediately to the web pages full of information, it's very useful, and it's very important for us that work that they tell us just 1 hour before the news, 2 hours before the news, and you have to study to understand, to look for information, to call the office, to download the images, and then to edit your write and edit your news report. And so this is very important to have this link in your tweet. But we have, as you see, not only we have to manage the image from satellite that are still image with the video, because in television you must use video. You can't do a news report only with the images. It is terrible. And so the problem is to match these two necessities for our work. And this is an example. I recently used this image of the floods and the sediments in the Adriatic Sea, as you see in the left of the image. And local team is an Italian news video service for journalists. And so I use the same image from the drone of local team and for satellite, just to make people understand what is happening, because this can give you an idea of the damage of the environment in northern Italy. Another example, the image from appunto Copernicus EMS, and the same images from the little city, as was, as you see, covered by floods. And this is a very news report of very big impact for people, because is with the images, with the video, we say in Italy that are best an image or video than 1,000 of words, because you can immediately give the idea of what is happening or what is happening. And at the same time, I can tell people that we have a so important instrument in Europe to protect the people from above, without using any word. Some time ago, I had a TV program, my own TV program about space and astronomy. I had 1 hour and a half to talk about satellite. Now, with only 1 minute, I have to be more rapid to give information. Another very hard thing to do in television is to make people understand the difference between climate and weather. I know that for research is very scientist is normal, this different, but people doesn't understand very much what is climate and what is weather, and the different map that we can have from satellite, from sentinels, from the meteorological satellite. And so even in this case, it's very important to have the images, or to have, that is better, to have animation to use, to download and to use for our news. And so, which are the challenges? The challenges for journalists who work on television, just like me, is to find map and data explanation. So we have, so we don't have to look for them in a lot of internet pages, but we have everything in the same page, so we can have time. Our little time is to use to understand and to give the correct information. the time to find information. It is the same problem to explain a map and to have time to read it. You find it in the same place, and so it's very important. Another thing that we need as a TV journalist is an interview. It could be very important to have some reference name and the way to have an interview with researchers and to find them near a map or near an image to have the correct information. Sometimes there are a lot of people who give you their mobile number, but they are not they are not a researcher, they are not affiliated with some university, but they are ready to answer you. And this is why sometimes there are some problems with the scientific culture on media, on Italian media. So to have some reference, some immediate reference, it could be very, very important. And then the last but not least, more workshop for media. It's for me, it's every time it's good to learn, but in my opinion, there must be more and more workshop for journalists to understand this instrument, to understand, to use this map, to explain it to people, because technology is always going on, and we need to understand and to have the capability to explain it to people. And so Peter before told that there are 3D animation, and it is very important for me because 3D animation, I haven't find them, and so if I can have a link, it could be very important for me. Thank you. Because 3D animation is a video, and so I can use it on television. It's better than an app. And so this is my work. This is some challenges that I try to face every day. And thank you for everything you said before, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Letizia. That was very interesting. Next presenter, last but not least for today, is Jason Box. He's a climatologist from the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, and obviously he'll be talking about monitoring of the Greenland ice sheet. The floor is yours, Jason. Go ahead.
Okay, just want to confirm you can see my screen.
Yes, we see your screen and we hear you nice and clear.
All right, I'm going to be focusing on satellite optical Earth observation and how we are visualizing that, and then talking about how to share what we find with the public using social media and traditional media. So we explore our data sets, this through an ESA contract, and we find extremes. In this case, 2019, the Greenland ice sheet was melting a lot, so the surface gets darker, it absorbs more sunlight and melts a lot more. This was tied for record ice loss. And so it's an example of a visualization where you can easily see the darkness with your own eyes and get that out into the public. We also look at the same data through time. This is over all of Greenland. You can see 2019 again here in the red curves below, dipping down below what was recorded earlier by this Sentinel-3 satellite. On the right side, you can see the September 2022 gray curve, where there was a very late season extreme melting. And it really stands out in the data, and it's easy to see with your own eyes how extreme that was. We like to animate the data, right? It's nice to look at, it's very informative. This is the snow line, what separates bare ice from the snow inland. And this was during a record warm year, 2012. Where I think it's very informative, educational to see with your own eyes what the data are showing. Similarly, the bare ice area, remember 2019 was a big melt year, and so the bare ice hit 200,000 square kilometers. That was something like 2-3 times what it was in the cold years. We're retrieving other physical properties through ESA contracts, and ESA is very interested in us getting into communication, getting the science out into the public, demonstrating value of these Copernicus sensors. This is a snow optical grain diameter, so when the surface is melting, you get some larger snow grains, and we did an ESA web story on this. Ice algae, it's chlorophyll, plant life on the Greenland ice sheet that is getting an increasing amount of attention because it's really dark. It's actually the primary darkening factor. So here we can make a visualization which shows the evolution of this darkness. The red colors are the darkest areas during a record warm summer. And we're starting to look at other retrievables, flooded ice. So this is when there's like slush or it's been raining, there's a lot of water. These are the blue classified areas. So making maps like this, and in this case, there was a heat wave across northern Greenland, and you'll notice a lot of blue pixels there. Just a short-lived heat wave that did get some media attention. Copernicus and getting the data into Copernicus Climate Services, there's something called the Copernicus Arctic Regional Reanalysis, CARA. And there we can put the data in to make a much more realistic representation of the albedo, the reflectivity of the ice, as compared to ERA 5 on the left, which has always constant high albedo. And so this CARA data set in much finer horizontal grid spacing is an excellent, new, precise, spectacular data set available from the Copernicus Climate Data Store. And you can see we're using other optical satellite missions to cover now the whole Arctic in a project called CARA 2. So there will be this reanalysis data like ERA 5, but just for the Arctic at a very fine spatial resolution. The European State of the Climate Report, we wrote a section on the 2022 September heat waves. On the left is the CARA data, where you can see all of the Septembers the last 31 years and how September of 2022 was off the charts warm. And a visualization on the right side of there were a number of heat waves. There was a stuck weather pattern that kept pumping atmospheric rivers and heat to Greenland. And there's an attempt to visualize that most of these animations I'm sharing on Twitter. The European State of the Climate Report, we got to exploit the Sentinel-2 data. And in the darker image, that's in 2022, September, when there was bare ice higher inland than normal. And, seeing is believing. Just looking at these photographs from space really communicate the changes very clearly. And because there's some segment of the population, a rather large segment, that's using YouTube, I made a YouTube video version of this, and it did quite well for my videos with 7,000 views so far and just out for 1 month. And it showcases the Copernicus data and some of the additional graphics that we produced that didn't make the final cut into the European State of the Climate Report. So making video versions on YouTube is a super effective way to get out to the public. Sentinel-2, again, the photographic images from space, the progression of melt over the 2019 melt summer. You see lakes forming. They're about up to 2 kilometers in width, and you can see that they drain, a very dynamic surface gets dark, and then the animation ends when snow returns at the end of the melt season, right about here. And so made a video about this, got to kind of scan across these beautiful images, although it was an ominous event where there was rainfall high up on the Greenland ice sheet. And the Sentinel-2 imagery clearly show actual flooding, river networks as the water's draining down the surface. And there's 3.8 thousand views to this video, which was about a scientific article that we published. And there's a link to the article in the description, but it gives us a way to make a voiceover and to use plain language so that it's more accessible to the public, what all of this science is about in Earth observation. And mass media, traditional media, communicating with newspapers, in this case, Denmark's most read newspaper, the headline, "When It Rains on the Inland Ice." The team of professional journalists, they, after many interviews, then they make a really nice web version of this where you can scroll through the images, and it was a front page of the Sunday newspaper. So this got something like 400,000 Danish people looking at it. Yeah, and I would just say, I think as the previous speaker was talking about, having a network of journalists to reach out to and say, hey, I've got something really interesting. Sometimes the journalists will pick it up and then help communicate that to a large audience. Sentinel-2, looking at the largest Greenland glaciers, we were systematically mapping the top 50 tidewater glaciers. This is the widest glacier in West Greenland, one of the widest. It's the fastest moving glacier in the world. And we can easily visualize the front of this thing, measure retreat, and then share this in social media. This is a glacier in South Greenland, just two different images where over time you can see it retreating out of the ocean. The ice is melting really faster than anywhere in Greenland in the southern tip. In 2020, the Arctic's largest remaining ice shelf had a disintegration on part of it, a northern tributary. And this was a global story. Ice shelves really captivate the attention. They're an effective climate indicator when they disintegrate. That says a lot about the warming Arctic. And like a video explaining how this is entitled, How We Already Know 2019 Will Be a Big Melt Year. This was released before the melt season, and by putting some arrows on the graphic to explain there was a snow deficit. The ice sheet had thin snow cover, and that made it easy to predict that the ice sheet would go into a bigger melt, because with a thin snow cover, it's going to melt more quickly, exposing dark ice and allowing the albedo feedback to do its thing. So that's my last slide, and I already mentioned plain language. That's what I've learned by working with journalists. Don't use technical jargon, use plain language and street language even, and that really works to communicate. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jason. We have a little bit of time still for questions, even if not much. So thanks, first of all, to all speakers. And we are waiting for the questions to come up. So we still cannot address all of the question here. I just would like to pick some of them. And if you go to the Slido webpage, you will also see that most of the questions have already been answered, or at least been tried to be answered in written. But I take the first question, and this can probably be best answered by Zach, I guess.
is regarding data visualization. How do you deal with a polar hole where you have either very little or no data available?
For a lot of my data visualizations, I actually leave the hole there. I find just instead of trying to smooth over it, I find just being more explicit about data uncertainties really builds trust into climate science data. For communicating more real-time data, this polar hole seems to be less of an issue for the products I use, where some of the newer products actually have data that covers the entire Arctic, so it hasn't come up as much of an issue as if I were comparing earlier satellite era observations. But I find just being explicit about the data without trying to change it too much, it really helps to build more trust rather than trying to smooth over something just to make it prettier.
Okay, thank you. So on the extracting images, I already said a few words before. I think there's nothing to add to this other than you may want to join next week's webinar where we'll get more into how to actually produce the maps and plots and other visualizations. There is one question regarding droughts and how droughts can be determined from satellite data. Maybe Valentin, would you like to comment on that? Is Valentin still here?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think I did answer in the comments. Well, actually, the European Drought Observatory released fact sheets with their methodology, so it was quite easy to understand about the thresholds and which parameters they take into account. Do you want me to dive into details or?
Well, I'm afraid we don't have the time to dive into the details, but I think.
Okay, well, if you're interested in about this question, you can just go in Slido, and I send the link to the fact sheet and with the methodology in the comments, so you can get the link there. I will send it again on the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So everybody sees that. And yeah, I just wanted to make a little, maybe a last round before we close this workshop with a question that I've seen. I don't see it here, which was brought up, but it's there somewhere. A question on what you think the major challenges are in communicating extremes, and how do you deal with these challenges? How do you address them? Keywords being simplification and communicating in an unbiased way. Somebody volunteering to go first, comment on that? Jason, you have mentioned some of this in terms of, speak jargon, use plain language. Do you have any further recommendations for people?
Well, again, connecting with journalists is a great way to amplify the message, or filmmakers, different forms of media, not just Twitter, because only some fraction is on that in that space. Use as many spaces as you have time for.
Okay, thank you. As we have a journalist here, Letizia, what will be your wish more towards us as a community? How could we better help you in communicating?
And I think that there isn't a right recipe to work with journalists, because I think that every television, every media is kind of work, but in general, I think that it's important to have a big help from you in understanding your work, understanding what you are doing, understanding the map that you are producing with satellite, and to have, as I said before, people to ask for information in a very short time, because if I have to go on air in the evening news and I know at 4 o'clock that I have to do a TV report, I need to find someone that can help me immediately and give me an interview. And so it's important to have people that can help us to understand, to explain, and to be yes, that we can meet in a very easy way.
Okay, so a direct point of contact, ideally with
Yes.
somebody who is also ready to jump into a TV interview.
Yes.
I can see the challenge on our side.
Yes.
But thanks very much for this.
If I can add something about this
Sure.
question for science
Please.
issues, it's of course complicated to find a balance between simplifying information and introducing bias, but for very technical issues, it's often very practical to ask directly searchers or even the source of the data or the source of the explanations after the simplification work. So as journalists, we made the data or the information understandable by general public, but before releasing it, just make it check by specialists or by the source, just to be sure that the simplification is still accurate.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Yes.
How do we do?
Okay. Thank you all very much. In the interest of time, I'm really sorry we need to wrap up this webinar today. Thank you very much to all the speakers of today. It was a very interesting webinar, at least for me. I hope for many others too. The recordings as well as the slides will be made available, and as Gabriel has mentioned at the beginning, all registered participants will be informed about that. But I don't want to miss the chance to once more advertise our last webinar in this series, which is happening in a week from now, next week on June the 20th at the same time. We will be more practical, hopefully, in how to access and process Copernicus and EUMETSAT data. And it would be a pleasure for all of us to see you again back there. And with that, thank you all. Thanks also to our participants. Thanks to the colleagues who organized this webinar, and thanks very much also for the technical support. Have a good afternoon, everybody, and hope to see you again at some point.
Goodbye.